Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The history of humankind has been one of catastrophic war, violence, and brutality. With each century, more people are killed through war and war-related injuries in that century than all the previous centuries put together. With each succeeding century, the numbers increase and the trend continues. The Bureau of Atomic Sciences has pushed the doomsday clock, an indicator of their research measuring the likelihood of a nuclear holocaust event occurring, to 100 seconds before midnight, the closest to midnight since its inception in 1947. The data is irrefutable, yet the historical narrative created has largely been one-sided. The very solutions to the problem have been met with more of the same, which only perpetuates the problem. We need a revolutionary narrative that would combine and link a radical restructuring of the political, economic, spiritual, and intellectual systems of the country. We need a life-affirming radical love that is transpersonal and universal. A concern with care and respect for all humans that in reality is the only alternative to the destructive cycle of a fear-based worldview of violence that threatens all of us with extinction. Our guests today on the Radical Imagination have been in the forefront of radical peace activism for decades. Medea Benjamin is a co-founder of the feminist anti-war group Code Pink, Women for Peace. She's been active in the anti-sweatshop movement and co-founded the free trade advocacy group Global Exchange, which advocates for fair trade alternatives to corporate globalization. She has engaged in numerous protests here and around the world, including an arrest and deportation from Egypt for her lead organizing in the Gaza Freedom March, where she was detained and beaten. Medea has been the recipient of numerous Peace Prize awards, including the 2004 Gandhi Peace Award, the 2000 Martin Luther King Peace Award as well. Nicholas Davies is an independent journalist and is the author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. He's a researcher with Code Pink, has co-authored numerous articles with Medea, and writes extensively for the Huffington Post, Alternate, Consortium News, Common Dreams, Salon, The Progressive, and Foreign Policy in Focus. Nicholas and Medea have recently co-authored the groundbreaking and invaluable primer and guide, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, which hopefully will become a catalyst to a new and powerful anti-war movement in this country and around the world. So thank you so very, very much, both of you, for being here today and to discuss this incredible book that you've just finished, right? Just fresh off the press here. Wrote it in a couple of months, breakneck speed. It's an incredibly detailed and nuanced work that, again, as I say, will hopefully be the catalyst for a powerful new anti-war movement and so on. But let's talk, first of all, about Ukraine, and which we've been led to believe is a conflict between an evil empire and an innocent victim. So could you explain a little more for our audience some of the nuances, some of the background, some of the history and important events leading up to the conflict? We get us started, Medea, or?
Sorry. Yes. Well, as we do extensively in the book, we try to lay out what is the context for this war because we think that so many Americans think it just fell from the sky. This was just Russia's attempt to take over Ukraine, and that it's a black and white situation. And so, what we go into in the book is the various instances in which the US and West have defied the overtures of Russia to talk about their security concerns and gone right ahead and run roughshod over them. One is the extension of NATO, which some people in this country like to dismiss, but we try very carefully in our book to show all of the warnings that there were that came from U.S. officials, including ambassadors who were based in the Soviet Union at the time. We go in and look at academics, at people in the region who, and of course, the Russians themselves, who kept saying that the expansion of NATO was a violation of the agreements that the US had and that it violated Russia's security. Nonetheless, the US kept that expansion going and right up to the borders, where then was threatening that Ukraine would also become a part of NATO. NATO being an aggressive, dangerous military alliance that was about to create a bulkhead at its border, along with Ukraine. And so this was one of the issues that really set up the context with Ukraine being invited in 2008 to join NATO. And from then on, really starting to incorporate Ukraine not as an official member of NATO, but in many ways a de facto member of NATO. And I'll leave it to my co author, Nicholas, to talk about some of the other important context in which this war has taken place.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yes, I think one of the one of the memes, if you like, that we get from people pushing back at some of our book events, and of course what you hear all the time in the media here is that this is really all about President Vladimir Putin. You know, that he has ambitions to remake the Russian Empire, and if he isn't stopped in Ukraine, then, you know, who knows where he'll march into next, and all of that. And the people saying these things dismiss the idea that Russia might have had some legitimate concerns about NATO expanding right up to its borders, but in reality, the senior Western officials warned President Clinton in the 1990s that the whole notion of expanding NATO into Eastern Europe was extremely dangerous. 50 US foreign policy experts wrote to President Clinton when he was considering this, and they called it a policy error of historic proportions. When Clinton went ahead with it in 1998, George Kennan, the godfather of the Cold War, gave an interview to the New York Times in which he called this a new Cold War, and really just lamented that this was absolutely unnecessary. Nobody was threatening anybody. The Cold War was finally over, and this really could not have been more counterproductive. And of course, all those warnings took place in a world and in a United States where nobody had ever heard of Vladimir Putin. So I mean, this the notion that this is all about Putin is really just a complete misreading of the situation. And then, of course, and we also quote in the book William Burns, who is now the director of the CIA, when he was the US ambassador to Moscow in 2008, when George Bush insisted over the objections of the Germans and the French and other NATO members that Ukraine should be invited to join NATO. This is what Burns wrote to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He said, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests.
Right.
We just wrote a new article, which was published yesterday by a number of outlets, including Counterpunch, for instance, and the title is "The Ukraine Crisis is a Classic Security Dilemma." And so we use the concept of a security dilemma to try and back off from these one-sided points of view that we hear both from our own government and the Ukrainians on one side and from Russia on the other, to just see how each side here had legitimate security interests. The countries that were joining NATO certainly believed that they were doing so for defensive purposes and to somehow try to ensure their own security. But on the other hand, Russia saw its own security threatened and diminished by these Western actions. And so here this is a classic situation in which countries on both sides are acting as they believe it for their own security. But the net result is an arms race and increasing tensions, and ultimately a path to war. And this is what we have seen.
I think it's profoundly important that you've created this book, seeing the perspective from both sides, from a number of sides, and using language that would not inflame more. But you're not shying away from statements, for example, that the conflict might be an example of a catalyst for a new political and military world order. And to quote Biden on this is about the future of the liberal world order, and we have to stand firm. So, I mean, there's a history of these peoples, obviously. I mean, do you want to fill us in a little bit historically about the relationship between the various peoples involved here in this struggle, and then take us to America's influence and penetration into this conflict?
You want to start?
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, well, I mean, what we saw at the end of the Cold War, as we were all hoping for a peace dividend, the West behaved very opportunistically. It sent a lot of economic advisors into Eastern Europe, including into Russia and Ukraine, and rammed through what is referred to as an economic shock therapy, which was this sort of almost, in historical terms, almost overnight privatization of those and corporatization of those economies, throwing them open to foreign investors, allowing Russian managers to become, as we now call them, oligarchs, and simply scarf up, all the industrial and agricultural and mining and oil assets of those countries. what happened in Russia was perhaps more extreme than in Ukraine, but it was a very similar pattern, which saw both of the people, millions of people in both those countries reduced to poverty, and such economic contraction that in both countries their actual life expectancy of people in those countries shrank by several years. So focusing on Ukraine in particular, gradually, as we went into the 21st century, their government was rife with corruption. These oligarchs controlled more and more of the economy, and but then a dynamic developed in which politicians and oligarchs were either allied more closely with the West or allied more closely with Russia and the industrial eastern part of Ukraine known as Donbass. And so a sort of tug of war developed in terms of the Ukrainian government, and yet each successive president and government ended up collapsing in various corruption scandals. So a Western president named Yushchenko was elected to great acclaim in what was called the Orange Revolution, but within a couple of years, he too was mired in corruption scandals, and he actually appointed his opponent, Yanukovych, who had been the governor of Donetsk in the east, appointed him as prime minister. Then in the next election, Yanukovych became president, and this gave rise to really, the events that we dedicate most of a chapter to in the book, which are the events of 2013 and 2014, which began with peaceful protests in Kyiv when Yanukovych said no to admittedly unfair agreement that was presented him by the European Union to put Ukraine on a path to EU membership. It would have opened up the economy of Ukraine to Western investors and to European corporations, but without a reciprocal opening up of the European Union to Ukrainian businesses. And so peaceful protests, led mostly by people from the west of Ukraine, began in Kyiv. They were repressed by the police, and things became gradually more and more violent. And and as they became a contest of force between the police and the protesters, extreme right-wing groups, including the neo-Nazi Svoboda Party, and then a group called Right Sector, basically formed militias to fight the police. And by January, they were conducting full-scale marches with weapons to try and march on the Parliament building. And they were demanding the resignation of Yanukovych and threatening to overthrow the government. The US supported the protesters under Assistant Secretary Victoria Nuland, and the US Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt can be heard on a tape that presumably leaked by the Russians, essentially handpicking who they wanted to form the new government of Ukraine once Yanukovych was overthrown. And eventually this all climaxed in February 2014 with the armed protesters marching on Parliament, the opposition politicians declaring that Yanukovych had resigned, which he never actually did, and forming a new government. The legitimacy of that government was questioned by many Ukrainians in many parts of Ukraine. A Gallup poll 2 months after Yanukovych was overthrown found that only 51% of Ukrainians considered the post-coup government to be the legitimate government of Ukraine, and in the parts of Ukraine where large majorities spoke Russian and as their first language and had close ties with Russia. Just as the previously the pro-EU forces and the pro-Western forces had been launching big demonstrations, now you had big demonstrations launched by people opposing the new government. And in fact, Crimea, which had an autonomous status in its own parliament, they basically decided that they would like to leave Ukraine. They held a referendum, which passed overwhelmingly, and Russia accepted Crimea's return to Russia, which it had been part of for a couple of hundred years, but had actually, become part of Ukraine in the 1950s. In the east, the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk basically just declared independence after also holding referenda, and Russia did not accept them. In fact, Russia had counseled them not to hold this referenda at that time until they could be done in a way that would be recognized. However, what developed in the east of Ukraine as a result of this was a civil war that then raged for the next couple of years and ended up killing 14,000 people. The post-coup Ukrainian government formed new National Guard units, which it sent to fight in eastern Ukraine against the breakaway republics, and they were led. Some of their most aggressive units were formed from those same extreme right-wing neo-Nazi units that had been part of the revolution against Yanukovych. And so this was an incredibly violent situation. Thousands of people were being killed, and that was to some extent brought to an end by an agreement in February 2015 called the Minsk II Agreement. And we go into that more in the book, and how that succeeded in ending the worst of the fighting, but failed politically through really the lack of support of the Ukrainian government, but also the lack of support from the United States and the West.
And lack of creating the political structures that could continue what had been started, correct?
Yes, I mean, what the Minsk II Agreement called for was, in fact, for those self-declared republics, the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, to actually, in order to keep them within Ukraine agreed in the Minsk II Agreement to grant them an autonomous status, where they would have a greater degree of internal self-government, and in exchange, and be able to maintain some of the ties that they wanted to maintain with Russia, and that was basically the agreement for them to give up their claims of independence and remain within Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian government failed to push through the legislation. It was violently opposed by the extreme right-wing forces in Ukraine, who really just wanted to fight to reconquer those areas.
Right.
And so we ended up in 2022, 7 years after the signing of the Minsk II agreement, with the status of those regions still unresolved, and a line of control and a buffer zone between the Ukrainian government forces and the forces of the breakaway republics supported by the Russians.
So Medea, so what was the event that really took us over the edge here to as Russia invades? Take us up to that moment, perhaps?
Well, after the Minsk agreement was signed, one would have expected that this would be a calming of the situation and a signal not to go forward with some kind of prospect of a military conflict. But on the contrary, after the signing of the agreement, the Western countries started arming Ukraine and training Ukrainian soldiers. When it was under Obama, there was this prohibition on sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. But after Obama, with Trump coming in, that was lifted. And we saw recently in an interview that Angela Merkel from Germany, the former head of Germany, said that the Minsk agreement was used as a time to buy time for Ukraine, meaning that it was used to build up the Ukrainian military and arsenal. And so you saw year after year the Western countries, and particularly the United States, because let's face it, when you talk about NATO, you're really talking about control by the United States, taking advantage of that situation and the lack of implementation of the Minsk Accords to build up Ukraine. And the fighting was not as severe as it was in 2014, but it did continue. And just weeks before the Russian invasion in February, there was an increase in the number of incidents along the border, mostly coming from the Ukrainian side into those breakaway republics. And Russia was amassing its troops along the border, insisting that it wasn't going to invade, while President Biden kept saying they're about to invade, they're about to invade. The Russians actually decided to go ahead and invade. And that was, of course, February 24th. In the book, we are very clear to condemn the Russian invasion because we don't believe it is justifiable on any grounds. It violates the UN Charter. It violates the Kellogg-Briand Act. It has created such a horrific humanitarian crisis. But we do try to let the American people understand, just as Nicholas was laying the story out. This is a story that the American people haven't heard. And so while they think the war started on February 24th, the war started back in 2014. And this is, of course, a much, much more horrific continuation and expansion of that war. And we are seeing how the preparation by the US and NATO countries has really been another provocation for Russia to think that perhaps Ukraine was about to launch a very intense invasion of that Donbas region, or even try to retake Crimea. So some say that Russia did this preemptively. We say no matter what Russia was thinking, this was not the way to resolve the problem.
Right. So what do you see as the role of U.S. arms merchants, weapons conglomerates in this conflict? I mean, influencing American foreign policy in a bipartisan way, in a sense. We have two war parties, as I keep mentioning.
Absolutely, and it's been horrific to see the increased power of this weapons industry, the military-industrial congressional complex that Eisenhower warned us against in 1961. now we see it in full force, where these companies are so embedded in our government that they really do have a very important role in determining policy. You have to just think about the now Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who came to us directly from the board of Raytheon. So many people in government, including our Secretary of State, who's supposed to be the number one diplomat, is someone who came from a lobbying firm that helped get defense contracts, or military contracts, we call them, for a variety of corporations. And he, instead of playing the role of diplomat, has been going around the world trying to get more contracts for sending weapons to Ukraine, most of those contracts going to US companies. So not only do we see their stock soaring, but we also see a loosening in the way that those contracts are made by the government. In this recent National Defense Authorization Act, there was a little known amendment that was put in there that allows these weapons contracts to be multi-year contracts, meaning they don't have to be approved every year by Congress, and also no bid contracts, of course, guaranteeing profits for these weapons industries. So they play a tremendous role in this. And we saw when there was a CBS News report that came out that said perhaps as many as 70% of the weapons we were sending there were not going to their intended front lines, that this created such a scandal that CBS was forced to take that documentary off the air because there's not criticism allowed of these weapon companies. They're now portraying themselves as heroes that are defending our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, where they are war profiteers that have profited off of the wars, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and so on, and are certainly profiting tremendously today. So that even if there were a sitting down at the peace table, we see that these weapons companies will want to keep the level of production going that they have managed to get with these $40 billion tranches, or the most recent $45 billion tranche. And let's also say that whether it's NATO or the Biden administration, or before them, the Republican administrations, and these weapon companies, they all have their sights set on China. And so while they are now working to weaken Russia, they have already been trying to embed in the minds of the American public and the European public that the Chinese are our real enemies. And so no matter what happens with Russia, we must be preparing ourselves for a war with China.
Yep. Well, we're far from going to the peace table there, Medea. That was very hopeful thing. But again, what can we do in the face of these enormous distortions? And what your account throws me back to memories of Vietnam, and how for so long the American public was really hoodwinked and not given really much of the true narrative behind that. But again, that peace movement started very slowly with a very tiny fraction of people supporting it, and then grew to be the majority of the population. Is that what you're hoping for at this point? And also, please mention the in addition to the armaments you're talking about, what about the dangers of some sort of nuclear confrontation? Please address that too.
You want to start, Nicholas?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, part of what those contracts that Medea is talking about are to, the weapons sent to Ukraine were mostly weapons out of US and other stockpiles. And some of those have actually, in fact, already been replaced. But on the pretext of replenishing those stockpiles, what the latest military spending bill did was to lock in these contracts for huge quantities of these weapons. Whereas the US has committed to sending, I think, 38 of these HIMARS rocket systems to Ukraine. I don't think they have even all been delivered yet. These multi-year contracts would, quote unquote, replenish those 38 HIMARS rocket systems with 700 HIMARS rocket systems. And Mark Kansian, who we quoted in our article about this, he's former senior official at the Office of Management and Budget, retired Marine officer, and who now works at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He for an article in Defense News, he actually said explicitly, these weapons are not for Ukraine. This is a stockpile of weapons for a major US ground war in Europe against Russia, obviously. And so that brings us to the danger you're talking about, Jim, which is, how does this end? I mean, if this does not end and as soon as possible at the negotiating table, then what is going to happen here? Even Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who is a former Prime Minister of Norway, he told in a Norwegian interview recently that his greatest fear for this winter is that the war will spread to become a wider direct war between NATO and Russia. I mean, he's not talking about if this goes on for another 10 years, this may happen. He's talking about this winter that may happen.
Yeah.
And as he said, if this goes wrong, it can go horribly wrong. That's what he said. I would just ask all your viewers, how on earth did we end up here? From the end of the Cold War 30 years ago, when we all hoped for a peace dividend, between NATO expansion, between the military-industrial complex taking advantage of a terrorist attack on New York and Washington to launch what they called a war on terror, which was in fact the largest US military buildup of weapons. They increased the in the name of fighting terrorism, they increased the military budget to higher than it had ever been during the actual Cold War, when the United States faced a genuine peer competitor in the Soviet Union. And all this money paid for, more aircraft carriers, more nuclear submarines, more B-2 bombers, nuclear capable strategic bombers, which Congress had actually planned to scrap before 1991. But as a result of the first Gulf War, Congress put those back in the budget at an extraordinary price of about $2 billion for each bomber. And so gradually, the US, instead of the post-Cold War era becoming an era of peace that we all hoped for, it became an era of expanding American power, America's unipolar moment that, think tank creatures in Washington who called themselves neoconservatives, neocons, basically re-envisioned American military power, the use of military power in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, and just massively expanding weapons technology, and here and little by little, of course,
Yeah.
that became redirected from fighting Osama bin Laden to once again reviving the Cold War that all of us, all Americans, believed, that we had won, or that we had
It's over.
triumphed over the evil Soviet Empire, and now we had peace. And here we were, no more communists, or very few, in Eastern Europe or Russia. But here we are. We're back, as George Kennan predicted in 1998, if NATO expanded. We are back in what they like to call a new Cold War with Russia and China.
And once again, we need a strong, powerful anti-war movement. This time around, I'm not trying to be flippant, we do have Henry Kissinger on our side on this one, right? I mean,
Well, yeah.
He's made statements where Chomsky and Kissinger agree on this one aspect, that we need to get people to the negotiating table. But as you've pointed out too, Medea, we have very little control, American people, on what goes on in Russia, but we certainly have control here in our country through a mass movement. And that's what I know you are trying to mobilize and organize. I know there's something, you're going to have a mass protest in Times Square. I plan to be there on January 14th. You want to tell us a little about those plans and how you're trying to get so many of the young people involved in this, and how you're trying to build this movement?
Well, first, let's say some of the obstacles, which is that there is a mass media narrative, whether it's on the stations that consider themselves progressive or conservative, other than some exceptions like Tucker Carlson. You're hearing a very stilted view of what is happening. The other is that you have a Democrat in the White House. And so when there are Democrats, like the 30 progressive Democrats that signed a letter calling for negotiations and were slapped down so quickly they had to withdraw that letter. When there's a Democrat in the White House, it's hard to not only get Democrats in Congress, but also Democrats across the country who have been traditionally part of anti-war movements. Then let's face it, the U.S. was not the immediate aggressor, it was Russia. And so that makes people think that we should not be fighting U.S. policy, but we should be fighting Russia's, despite the fact, as you say, that we don't have any way of influencing Putin. So we have all of those obstacles together. You laughed about Kissinger having a good position on this. It's not just Kissinger, it's extreme right people in the Republican Party in Congress. It's people like Tucker Carlson. It's people like Donald Trump who say, if I was in the White House, I would talk to Putin and this war would be over. And so it's been very difficult. We find even within the few peace organizations that exist, there's a lot of educational work that has to be done to make people feel comfortable with the position of saying we must call for a ceasefire and negotiations. And so we are slowly building that up. That's why we not only wrote the book, but we've been on this massive book tour, 50 cities that we'll have gone to. And we are part of a group called Peace in Ukraine that is actually an alliance of both individuals and organizations. People who are watching this can become part of it by going to peaceinukraine.org. We meet every 2 weeks and come up with ideas or support other groups in their actions. You mentioned the one on January 14th in New York City. There's another one on February 19th that's happening in Washington, D.C. There are weeks of actions that are happening, like around the Martin Luther King week. And we are reaching out to new constituencies. We just had a very successful effort to bring in the faith-based community into a call for a Christmas truce. While we weren't successful in the Christmas truce, we were successful in getting, now I think it's over 1,200 leaders of all faiths to sign on to this call. and we want to use that base that we built to not only keep building it, but that they are asking for a meeting in the White House, and they do have contacts in the White House because they've been there at various prayer services. And we do want to keep that faith-based group moving forward with this call for negotiations. We're reaching out to the environmental community, the big organizations, as well as the smaller ones, to get them to realize that war is the worst thing for the environment, and that we'll never be able to really address the disaster of the climate unless we solve this problem of a war that could take us into a nuclear winter. And we're trying to reach out to all different walks of life, people that belong to Rotary clubs, people that are in World Affairs Councils, UN associations. It's difficult work. It takes a lot of effort. And we open up a hornet's nest when we go into some of these places, and ourselves are accused of being Putin apologists, even though I say that were I living in Russia, I'm pretty sure I'd be in jail for protesting this war.
Yeah.
In any case, this is part of the effort that we have to do to build up a new movement, to get new constituencies involved, and to really create this groundswell that pushes both the people who hold the purse strings in Congress, as well as the people in the White House, who should be talking to their counterparts. Biden should be talking to Putin. Anthony Blinken should be talking to Lavrov. And of course, all of them should be pushing the Ukrainians to peace talks as well.
How do you win your opponents over? What sort of language, narrative do you present in these discussions, meetings you have? Both of you.
I'll let you start, Nicholas. And
yeah, go ahead, Nicholas. How do you win? You're seemingly charming, articulate. How do you get your?
Well, I think as I said at the beginning of this show, I think it's important to explain to people that this is not all about Vladimir Putin, because one of the nasty things that that we find in American politics is that our politicians have discovered that personalizing things can be a powerful weapon. People, it's easier to get people to hate Vladimir Putin than it is to get people to hate, 200 million Russians. And so I try to, as you saw, point out that in fact, there were problems with these US policies long before anyone had ever heard of Vladimir Putin. So that's just one example.
Yeah. Of how
one example I use is to give examples of how there have been talks on specific things, because we get a lot of people saying you can't talk to Putin. And we say, well, there were talks early on in late March and early April when the war had first started. And those talks were actually going along well until the UK and the US came in and sabotaged these talks. We give also examples of talks that Ukraine and Russia have had in both getting the grain out of the country so that it could get into the hands of countries that have relied on that grain to feed their people. We've talked about the agreements that have been brokered to get the International Atomic Energy Association representatives into those the Zaporizhia nuclear plant to stop that from blowing up. And we talk about all the prisoner swaps that have been happening that take a lot of negotiating and trust. And then we talk about the fact that the U.S., while it hasn't been negotiating with Russia on these big issues, they have been talking about how to stop the war from expanding into a third world war or a nuclear war by having our Secretary of Defense talking to his Russian counterpart, having William Burns from the CIA talking to his counterpart. And so there are talks. Talks are possible, talks are necessary. And we also say to people, if you really care about the Ukrainian people, you don't want them going through this winter freezing. You don't want them continuing to suffer. You want them to be able to live in peace and the millions of refugees to be able to go back home, that the only way there's going to happen is at peace talks. And finally, I would say it's important to bring up what the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said, given his important place in the power structure of this country, when he said that the Ukrainians have done a great job resisting the Russians, but that basically now they're at a stalemate and that there is not a military victory, that with the winter coming on, this is a good time to seize the moment when Ukraine is in a relative position of strength and go to the peace table. If he is saying that, certainly we can say that, and certainly the people that we talk to should be able to contemplate that as a necessary way to move forward.
We will contemplate that, and we will be out there with you protesting. We're going to please read this book. Get it, War in Ukraine: Making Sense Out of a Senseless War. Thank you so very, very much for being here, both of you. It's been an honor, and it's just been a wonderful joy to hear this narrative, and we need to spread it all around so we can begin to stop this. Okay?
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
All the best. Thank you. And thank you so very, very much for listening to us today on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.